For more than a century, one of history's most notorious unidentified murderers has existed without a verified face. His name appears in books, films, police archives, and countless theories. But in the official record, Jack the Ripper remains what he was in 1888, an unknown murderer who disappeared into the streets of London. Then, a piece of Victorian fabric was said to contain something the original investigators could never have imagined: traces of DNA. And according to the man who commissioned the testing, that DNA pointed toward a suspect already known to Victorian police. The claim was extraordinary. Had science finally given a name to the shadow? Before answering that question, it is important to remember that this is not merely a story about an unidentified killer. It is the story of 5 women whose lives were gradually eclipsed by the legend surrounding their deaths. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly; Annie Chapman; Elizabeth Stride; Catherine Eddowes; and Mary Jane Kelly. These are the 5 women most commonly connected to the same murderer, although the precise number of victims has never been established with certainty. They were mothers, partners, workers, migrants, and women trying to survive inside one of Victorian London's poorest districts. Contrary to a claim repeated for generations, historians do not accept that all 5 were working as prostitutes when they died. Whitechapel in 1888 was densely populated and deeply unequal. Families crowded into damp rooms. Employment was insecure. Lodging houses could shelter hundreds of temporary residents, many of whom changed addresses constantly. The familiar image of a permanently fog-covered district belongs partly to later mythology. The real conditions were less theatrical, but no less useful to someone trying to remain unseen. The murderer did not need supernatural skill to disappear. He operated at night, among narrow passages, crowded housing, irregular workers, and people accustomed to strangers passing through. There were no security cameras, no DNA databases, and no reliable fingerprint system available to investigators. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police also controlled different parts of the area, requiring 2 forces to coordinate during a rapidly developing crisis. Police increased patrols, used plainclothes officers, interviewed thousands of people, and pursued an enormous number of tips. Yet every new report created more noise. Witness descriptions conflicted. Suspects appeared and disappeared. Hundreds of letters arrived from people claiming to be the murderer. One of those letters popularized the name Jack the Ripper. Its author was never authenticated. The real killer may never have used that name at all. What later looked like the work of a criminal genius may have been something far less impressive: opportunity, urban anonymity, investigative limitations, and extraordinary luck. But on the night Catherine Eddowes died, an object was supposedly removed from the scene. More than a century later, that object would become the center of the most controversial attempt ever made to identify Jack the Ripper. It was described as a shawl, and if its history could be trusted, it might contain the only surviving biological trace connecting a victim to a suspect. The story of the shawl begins with a family tradition. According to that account, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson acquired the fabric after Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square in September 1888. He supposedly brought it home, where it was preserved by his family, and passed through several generations. But this history presents an immediate problem. No surviving contemporary police record securely establishes that Simpson collected the object from the scene. The shawl was not preserved inside a sealed evidence system because no such forensic chain existed for it. Its connection to Catherine Eddowes depends largely on a story told after the event. Over the following century, the fabric passed through private hands. It was displayed, examined, and exposed to people whose biological traces could have been transferred without anyone noticing. That does not prove the object is unrelated to the case, but it means every scientific conclusion must begin with uncertainty. In 2007, British author Russell Edwards purchased the shawl at auction. Convinced that it represented authentic evidence, he asked molecular biologist Jari Luhalainen to examine stains and cellular material preserved within its fibers. The investigation eventually produced two highly publicized claims. One mitochondrial DNA profile was reported as compatible with a maternal line descendant of Catherine Eddowes. Another was said to be compatible with the maternal family line of Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was not a newly invented suspect. He was a Polish Jewish immigrant whose family had escaped persecution in Eastern Europe and settled in London's East End. He worked as a barber or hairdresser and lived close to Whitechapel. Years after the murders, police memoranda and private annotations referred to a man named Kosminski as a suspect, but those later accounts contain inconsistencies. They were written after the central investigation, and historians continue to debate whether every reference even described the same individual. Aaron Kosminski was never charged, tried, or directly connected to a crime scene through evidence accepted by a court. He was later confined in psychiatric institutions. That fact has often been used to make him appear more threatening in modern retellings. But mental illness is not evidence of murder, and it should never be treated as a substitute for proof. In 2014, Edwards publicly declared that the shawl had identified Kosminski as Jack the Ripper. The announcement spread rapidly around the world. In 2019, a scientific paper describing the mitochondrial DNA analysis was published online by the Journal of Forensic Sciences. For many readers, publication transformed an intriguing theory into an apparent solution. A Victorian police suspect, an object supposedly recovered beside a victim, biological traces associated with both family lines. Placed together, the pieces seemed almost impossible to dismiss. But forensic evidence is not judged by how compelling a story sounds. It is judged by what each piece can independently establish, and the DNA at the center of this mystery could not identify one person in the way many headlines suggested. The same is true of the murderer's ability to escape. The police did not simply ignore the crimes. They increased patrols, deployed plainclothes officers, interviewed thousands of people, and investigated a vast number of reports. But they worked before forensic blood typing, modern fingerprint identification, surveillance cameras, computerized records, or DNA analysis. Witnesses often saw a figure briefly, at night, under poor lighting. Descriptions were incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Whitechapel's lodging houses were filled with temporary residents. Workers entered and left the district at irregular hours. A man did not need to appear frightening to pass unnoticed. He may simply have appeared ordinary. Every false confession, fabricated letter, and sensational newspaper theory created another distraction. The murderer's continued freedom should not be mistaken for brilliance. He attacked vulnerable women and benefited from a city and an investigative system that could not yet reliably identify him. The shawl appeared to offer modern science a second opportunity. But before DNA could solve the mystery, history had to answer a more basic question: could the object itself be trusted? Most people are familiar with nuclear DNA, the genetic material often used in modern criminal investigations to distinguish one individual from almost everyone else. The shawl analysis relied principally on mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the maternal line. A mother passes it to her children, and relatives descended through the same maternal family can share the same or a very similar profile. Because many copies exist inside each cell, it can sometimes survive when ordinary nuclear DNA is too damaged to recover. This makes it valuable, but it also makes it less specific. A mitochondrial profile can support an association with a maternal lineage. It cannot, by itself, identify one unique man among every person who shared that lineage. A result compatible with Kosminski's maternal family is therefore not the same as a modern individual DNA identification. And even a genuine genetic association would leave several questions unanswered. Was the shawl truly present in Mitre Square in 1888? Were the tested traces deposited during the crime? Could later handling, storage, exhibitions, or previous examinations have introduced contamination? And if material associated with Kosminski's maternal line was present, what evidence proves that it came from the murderer? DNA cannot provide a date for when someone touched an object. It cannot reconstruct the object's undocumented journey. It cannot repair a broken chain of custody. The shawl was not sealed by Victorian investigators, stored under controlled conditions, and opened in a modern laboratory. It had passed through more than a century of private possession. That history does not automatically make testing worthless, but it sharply limits the conclusions that can responsibly be drawn. Scientists and historical researchers also questioned aspects of the methodology, the interpretation of the mitochondrial profiles, and the amount of underlying data made available for independent scrutiny. In 2024, the Journal of Forensic Sciences and its publisher issued an expression of concern regarding conclusions drawn from the mitochondrial DNA analysis. The journal requested the original raw mitochondrial DNA data so the scientific complaints could be examined. The authors reported that the data were no longer available because of equipment failure and other complications. Without those original files, the journal said that the questions surrounding the results could not be resolved. The article was not formally retracted, but the expression of concern remains an important warning that significant scientific doubts are still unresolved. In 2025, a correction was published. It added a previously missing funding statement. It did not recover the original data, validate the conclusions again, resolve the shawl's history, or remove the expression of concern. That same year, the case returned to international headlines. A descendant of Catherine Eddowes supported an effort seeking permission for a new inquest. For the family, the request was not simply about preserving a famous mystery. It represented a possibility of recognition and justice for a woman whose identity had long been overshadowed by her murderer's nickname. But the renewed attention did not come from a new DNA discovery. It came from an attempt to have the existing claims formally reconsidered. No court had identified Kosminski as the murderer, and the request itself was not a judicial verdict. Supporters of the Kosminski theory argue that the genetic associations become more meaningful because his name already appeared in historical police suspicions. Critics respond that uncertain provenance cannot be rescued by combining it with incomplete Victorian recollections. Both the history and the genetics contain clues. Neither produces a verified identification. The controversy, therefore, reveals something important about forensic science. A laboratory can detect genetic material with remarkable sensitivity. But sensitivity is not the same as certainty. The strength of a result depends on where the object came from, who handled it, how it was preserved, and what the genetic profile is actually capable of proving. The shawl may be connected to Catherine Eddowes. It may contain material associated with Kosminski's maternal family. Aaron Kosminski may even have been the murderer, but none of those possibilities establishes the next statement beyond reasonable doubt: that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. So, has Jack the Ripper finally been identified? The most responsible answer is no. Aaron Kosminski remains a historically significant suspect. He lived in the relevant district. His name appears in later police records, and the shawl analysis created an intriguing genetic association with his maternal family line. But an intriguing association is not a verdict. No reliable contemporary record proves that the shawl came from Catherine Eddowes' crime scene. No uncontaminated chain of custody connects it directly to 1888. Mitochondrial DNA cannot uniquely identify Kosminski, and the published interpretation has received a formal expression of concern. This does not settle Kosminski's historical status one way or another. It means the surviving evidence cannot responsibly prove that he was guilty. The same restraint must be applied to every other suspect proposed over the last century. Doctors, artists, merchants, aristocrats, immigrants, and members of the royal household have all been accused. Each theory selects certain details and creates a convincing narrative around them. None has produced evidence strong enough to close the case. Even the murderer's apparent ability to escape does not require the existence of a mastermind. He operated in an overcrowded district before modern forensic identification. People moved constantly between lodging houses, markets, workshops, and public streets. Investigators depended on human memory under conditions of darkness and fear. Two police jurisdictions shared parts of the investigation. Sensational newspapers spread speculation, while hoax letters and false confessions consumed attention and resources. The murderer may have understood the streets, but he may also have escaped arrest because witnesses were uncertain, evidence was fragile, police tools were limited, and chance repeatedly favored him. Calling that genius risks turning investigative failure into admiration. There is nothing admirable about a murderer selecting people whose poverty, insecure housing, and social isolation made them more vulnerable. His victims did not exist to create his legend. The identity of the murderer remains unknown. The identities of the women do not. Polly Nichols was more than the first name in a sequence. Annie Chapman was more than a location in a police file. Elizabeth Stride was more than half of a night, later transformed into legend. Catherine Eddowes was more than the source of disputed DNA. Mary Jane Kelly was more than the final image attached to the mystery. Their lives deserve the attention that history gave to the man who ended them. The DNA evidence points toward a possibility, but it does not deliver a verdict. Until stronger, independently verifiable evidence appears, Jack the Ripper remains unidentified. And perhaps the most important correction history can make is not to give the murderer a face, but to ensure that Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane are never again reduced to shadows behind his name. Thank you for watching. If this story made you see the world from a different perspective, subscribe to Silent Nature Mysteries. More mysteries are waiting to be discovered.